Coming up on this episode of the All Aboard podcast, we celebrate Amtrak's 53rd birthday by talking about the trains they are no longer running. Have your tickets out of the envelope, but don't expect to go anywhere. All aboard, please. Now boarding on track number 8 is train number 1, the All Aboard podcast, your twice weekly excursion into transportation excellence, and I am your conductor, Phil Bell, Enterprise B. PB Crisp, Mr. 645, coming to you from high atop the dome car on the Phil Bell Express. And I am blessed to hold the E. Hunter Harrison Chair here at the Bell Institute for Advanced Railroad Studies, where there are no degrees, because the learning never ceases. And for the second time this week, I'm blessed to be back behind this, the Brunswick Green PLB microphone. Now, I was a little bit tongue-in-cheek in my introduction there because, of course, we are talking about Amtrak's 53rd birthday. And first of all, happy birthday to them. And thanks to all the people who are working very hard at Amtrak, whether you're talking about the corporate level or otherwise, on the trains, maintaining them, you name it, because they do a lot of good work. And we are going to criticize them. We do criticize them a lot because they deserve it. But there are a lot of people there who work hard and they really believe in what they're doing and try to do the things necessary to make sure that we have trains to ride. And I want to encourage you to do this. Even though we may criticize them at times, even though we may romanticize some of the days gone by, sometimes justified and sometimes not, I hope that you will take the opportunity to ride as many Amtrak trains as you can whenever you get the opportunity. And that's because this effort to prepare for the show has really made me think a lot about the trains that aren't there, not just because we want to go through a historical record of them, but because of the fact that it is so fleeting. We saw this back when we talked about Via Rail a couple of months ago, how at one point Via was having a terrific service that seemingly went everywhere in Canada, and then one day so many of those trains were gone. And then as I did the research for this episode, it was so interesting to see how Amtrak was starting with next to nothing, but then it grew and got to be a very sizable operation, and then at various points throughout its history, there were congressional cutbacks, there were financial crutches, whatnot, and that meant so many trains went away, some of which have never come back. So, again, ride the trains. At least that way you will be able to say that you saw it and that you were part of it. And I'm not trying to get you to think that maybe all the trains are going away tomorrow, but we are not promised to have them. So please go ahead. Now, take a look at the thumbnail for this video because it's Amtrak's 53rd birthday, and that is train number 53, a shot that I took of the auto train, which was going southbound on the RF&P subdivision at Ripon Landing, and this was back in 2018. Ripon Landing, by the way, if you're in the Washington, D.C. area, or even just looking for a great place to rail fan on a weekend trip, it's a good place to go. Plenty of places to park, and also you get amazing views of CSX Amtrak trains on weekends and VRE Virginia Railway Express trains during the day. So bring your camera and you can sit there and relax. The only thing I'll warn you is you may have to worry about the insects because they can get to be a little bit of a pain then. But as to Amtrak, now its first train was number 235, a southbound clocker that was running from New York City to Philadelphia. Now, that's noteworthy for many reasons because, first of all, leaving New York City's Penn Station, that had been, into the 1960s, one of the more magnificent temples of railroading. And I encourage you to go take some looks, especially if you're on the audio side of the podcast, about what Penn Station really was. It was the Baths of Caracalla brought into the modern era and used as a train station. And it was a beautiful building based on all the photographs. I, of course, being 43 years old, am too young to have seen it. But the stories abound about it, and as we've talked about, that is what led to the modern day preservation movement of older buildings, and in some cases things like railroad equipment, because its demolition to sell the air rights for the placement of Madison Square Garden drew a lot of ire from New Yorkers who, of course, had deserted the passenger trains, but suddenly realized that it wasn't just that they could stand there and expect that everything would be the same all the time, that the trains would continue to run, and that the building would always be there, but they were going to have to be a part of it. And that is ultimately also what led to the preservation of Grand Central Terminal. So against this backdrop, you have train 235, that southbound clocker, departing from what was now a subterranean Penn Station, something that was a dramatic change, and in the eyes of most people, not for the better, that had been constructed by the Pennsylvania Railroad not that long beforehand. And then we get to the matter of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the company that given birth to the clocker in the first place. And that carrier had, as we know, merged with the New York Central on February 1st, 1968, and by mid-1970, it was bankrupt in the largest bankruptcy in history up to that point. It would take Enron to outdo the bankruptcy of Penn Central, and that gives you an idea of how long and how big that bankruptcy really was. Fun fact, by the time Enron went bankrupt, it hadn't been that long since the Penn Central bankruptcy had ended. It's just a little over a decade, so it tells you how long that process really took. But the interesting thing there is the clocker was in many ways emblematic of what had helped to bring the Penn Central down and the Pennsylvania itself. Now, of course, as we know, as we've discussed many a time on this podcast, a lot of it was management incompetence, failure to plan, the interference of the government, the federal government with the Interstate Commerce Commission, and the way that they had gone about the handling the merger process and making it something anywhere other than a free market. But the passenger trains that the Penn Central ran were big losses for the company. And that's because while they, in many cases, were actually not terrible, the Broadway Limited is a good example of that, although in some cases they were terrible based on all the stories. They were also money losing. And that's because so many passengers had deserted them and moved on. Some of that was due to actions the railroad took itself, but much of it was due to the competition and everything that we discussed in the previous episode, which I hope you'll go back to, and we have, of course, linked below. But the clocker itself, train number 235. First of all, Amtrak wasn't even sure they should be running that train, because the clockers, which ran on the hour, eventually around the clock, and that's where the name came from, even though the name was unofficial until the time of Amtrak, provided what was largely commuter service. These were people who were going from either New York City to Philadelphia or points in New Jersey to either New York City or Philadelphia. And initially consisted of about 15 trips per day, was of course eventually given the name Clocker. And for those on CP5 cam, let's see if we can't possibly get a photo of the Clockers up, because a lot of people tend to think that even though we're talking about a relatively short distance train, that it wasn't really it wasn't really substantial, and that these were just small trains. Well, actually, no, the clockers could be pretty substantial given the two major markets of New York City and Philadelphia that it served. And there, for those of you on CP5 cam, you see General Electric E60, in this case called an E60MA, because it was capable of producing or providing the head-end power to be used with the passenger cars after the Heritage fleet had been refurbished and also the AM fleets had been built. Just as a note, the E60CP, those had steam generators that were utilized, so that was one difference in these. And a lot of these, whether E60CPs or E60MAs, were eventually sold to New Jersey Transit and even to Black Mesa and Lake Powell. But we should actually have another episode to cover some of Amtrak's equipment, which we will do down the line. But this is the famous curve at Elizabeth, New Jersey, and you see a very long train of Heritage Fleet cars and an AM fleet, which looks like a lounge at the end. So these trains operated over the years, but they steadily declined in their number, and that was because Amtrak was actually expanding other services in the area. Some Metroliners, which was a growing brand of premium service, replaced them, as well as the Keystone service, which originally started as a Philadelphia to Harrisburg service, but eventually expanded all the way to New York City. Over time, Amtrak realized, well, we can expand this product, which is doing much better, and also pawn the commuters off, or I should say transition the commuters off to New Jersey Transit, where they were actually more at home, and this made more sense. Now, some of the sources out there talk about how a lot of passengers did prefer to ride Amtrak's clockers, obviously because the equipment was much more comfortable than New Jersey Transit, since New Jersey Transit does still in many cases have you sit three across in some places, depending on which equipment that you're aboard. And also there were fewer people, so that made the ride a little bit better. But also, another part of that is there was a large transfer of money going back and forth between both carriers, because you were able to use New Jersey Transit passes aboard the clockers, because the clockers were serving that suburban market outside of both New York City and Philadelphia. In 1999, the Hamilton Transit Center, which is outside of Trenton but in that area, was opened up. And then in 2005, Amtrak said goodbye to the last clocker, with New Jersey Transit providing additional service between New York City and the Hamilton Transit Center, which by and large took up what was left of the clockers market, even though it does not go into Philadelphia. And that has been a little bit of a point of contention over the years, because now if you were a passenger that was aboard a clocker, you'd have to find another way to get there. In general, that would be one of the regional trains, or Northeast Regional, which is the branding they're currently using, Acela Express, or the Keystone services. But if you are going to some of those intermediate points that were in New Jersey that were served by the clockers, you can certainly now do it from the Hamilton Transit Center going into New York City on New Jersey Transit's trains. So while the clockers are no longer operating, they are not an example of Amtrak being in decline or anything negative. In fact, they're actually an example of Amtrak having some positive growth, and that is something to be commended in the time since 1971. I should also note that there were not much in the way of significant changes schedule-wise, although the clockers did, of course, benefit from the Northeast Corridor Improvement Project and everything that went on with that over the years, which certainly made what was a railroad in decline that had parts of it that were higher speed and becoming high speed into a railroad that is very much a showpiece of Amtrak and for us as a nation when you're talking about passenger rail. Now, the second train we'd like to talk about today is one I'm quite fond of, and that is none other than the Montrealer. Now, the Montrealer always had some level of romance related to it, and I even remember this being a kid when we were on Amtrak Silver Star. It was with my grandmother, and we'd see the Montrealer, and just the idea of this train going to this far off foreign land, which of course wasn't really that far off, but as a kid I didn't know that, but the name was always very evocative. And its history actually started back in 1924. Now, this is a train that ran between Washington, D.C. and Montreal on the Pennsylvania, New Haven, Boston and Maine, and Central Vermont before getting onto the Canadian National for the last lap into Montreal itself, and there being Central Station. Southbound, it was known as the Washingtonian because Washington, D.C. was the southbound terminus, and northbound, of course, Montreal. Now, it was also known as the Bootlegger because it started operating, on the edge of the Prohibition era, and we all know that was probably one of the dumber things the country ever did. I know we're not getting political here, but honestly, anytime you're banning alcohol, and I'm not an alcoholic, but it didn't make any sense, but the train was nicknamed the Bootlegger, so that should give you an idea about some of the activities that were taking place aboard that train. Now, it did not, unfortunately, survive into Amtrak, as it was discontinued in 1966, but I want to show you, if you're on CP5 cam, a photo of its companion train. This is the Ambassador, which has, in this case, a couple of Boston and Maine F units there, and the one in the lead has the McGinnis scheme that was bought by Patrick McGinnis to the Boston and Maine after he got the boot from the New Haven, and he had done similar things with the paint on the New Haven. And then you see also some Central Vermont cars, and that's because reflective of the fact that the Ambassador, as well as the Washingtonian / Montrealer, did operate over a variety of railroads, and therefore you ended up sharing consists. Now, there's not a lot of photos of the Montrealer of that era because it operated overnight during this period. So, that is few and far between, and that would certainly come into the Amtrak era as well. Now, Amtrak's version started operating in 1972, and it took the same route. And according to 50 Years of Amtrak Trains, which was the primary source material for this conversation, and we will be reviewing in full tomorrow, which, by the way, is a great book. We'll have a link to it tomorrow, and it's the best $70 I ever spent, and its authors are amazing, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But it was the first Amtrak train to use onboard service personnel that Amtrak hired. Now, you've got to remember, when Amtrak started, there was a group of people who put together the route system, and that included Jim McClellan, who was the protagonist in The Men Who Love Trains, which we reviewed a few weeks ago. And there were, of course, the board of directors, the president, administration, and so on. But the trains, by and large, were operated by the host railroads, or actually were operated by the host railroads with the equipment that they provided. So there wasn't anything called an Amtrak identity early on, and that also includes the employees who were host railroad employees. So it took a while for Amtrak to then go from being absolutely nothing to having its own onboard service personnel, and that, just as a definition, does not include your conductor, your brakeman, your engineer. Those are considered train and engine employees. We're talking about people like the bartenders, the porters, the coach attendants, and so on. So this is noteworthy in that the Montrealer was the first time where Amtrak hired its own personnel for that. And it did something that was very interesting, harkening back to the old Washingtonian / Montrealer. And by the way, Amtrak's version also originally had that split name, Washingtonian South, Montrealer North. It served the Vermont ski areas, and that helped it to become a very popular train. So this was an early example of Amtrak getting out of what it originally started doing, which was simply to say, we're going to preserve existing trains and a limited number of existing trains, and then expanded to say, well, how can we be a little bit more market-oriented? So that was certainly a positive development. Now, it became very popular almost off the bat, partly because of the ski areas, but also because of the party atmosphere that was cultivated aboard the train, and that includes the Le Pub Lounge, which had a piano player on weekends. And I remember there was a Trains magazine article, I believe it was 1989, entitled "They're Partying Le Pub Again," and that's where they would talk about and had a photo of the piano player and everything else, and you just get the idea of what was happening there. And this is also a train that's operating in a corridor with many colleges nearby, if not actually on the route. So you can certainly see that combination of going to Montreal, which is a very laid-back city if you ever get a chance to visit, as well as going to some of these major markets in New York City, Washington, D.C., and then the ski areas. That certainly was not going to be your kind of everybody get on the train, be quiet, don't talk, don't look at anybody else, and certainly where they cultivated a very good atmosphere. But of course, things did not go all that well after the beginning, and that is because of the Boston and Maine. Now, the Boston and Maine, we've talked about the decline the B&M had along with other railroads in New England. In the early 1980s, it was sold to Guilford Transportation Industries, or Guilford, I think it was Guilford Systems, but Guilford Transportation Industries, later Pan Am Systems. And there it became, again, aligned with the Maine Central. And then it had, and briefly the Delaware and Hudson for a while, and then it had all of its track leased to the Springfield Terminal, which was a subsidiary of the Boston and Maine itself, so that the Springfield Terminal's work rules could govern operations on the entire B&M, as opposed to the B&M's more problematic heavy work rules. And I say that not because we're looking to criticize union employees, but quite frankly, if you're in a situation where you're going to have 3, 4, 5 men on a locomotive for a relatively short trip, you're not going to make much of a profit. And if you don't make a profit, you're going to end up in a situation where the Boston and Maine was. And in the 1980s, the track conditions on the Connecticut River line deteriorated substantially. And this meant a lot of derailments. This meant derailments for the Montrealer itself. And also, it meant running times that had absolutely gotten out of hand. So, Amtrak did something really controversial that's happened one time and never since, and that was utilizing the statutory authority it had then to seize a portion of the Connecticut River line between Windsor and Brattleboro, Vermont, from the Boston and Maine. And this was a big problem, which in many ways had some reverberations into the late 1990s when the Maine, I think it's Northeast Regional Passenger Rail Authority, started to fund the Downeaster and fund improvements on a former Boston and Maine, now at that time Guilford trackage. Technically it was Boston and Maine, but it was generally called Guilford Transportation Systems, Guilford Rail System, and then later on Pan Am Railways to operate the Downeaster. And a lot of people in that time criticized Guilford for being unwilling to let the Downeaster operate at the contracted speed, at least initially, and having a lot of going back and forth. And I can only surmise, and this is me personally, only surmise that a lot of it relates to the fact that Amtrak stepped in, and Amtrak, of course, wasn't as the operator of the Downeaster, and simply said, hey, we don't like the way that you're maintaining the Connecticut River line, which was bad, by the way, and we're going to take it from you. And they did. And so they refurbished it and sold it to the Central Vermont. And so this got to be a very, very big deal, because the idea of that statutory authority, which was never really intended to be exercised, or at least I don't think Congress had expected it to, was that if a railroad really let things get so bad that Amtrak could step in and keep trains running. But remember what some of the problems are. First of all, Amtrak itself, in most cases, operating one train, maybe two trains over most of its routes per day, does not generate the revenue to keep up with maintaining a rail line. And that's why we saw a lot of changes over the years, such as the Silver Star and the Carolinian, leaving what was the former Seaboard airline route between Norlina, North Carolina, and Petersburg, Virginia, because CSX simply said, look, we don't need this route. It has bridges on it. It has curves. We'd rather put all the trains on the Atlantic coastline and then operate them over a portion of the former Seaboard to get to Hamlet if trains have to go that way and then down to Atlanta. They attempted to sell that route to Amtrak, and Amtrak said no, and so CSX tore it up. Now, in recent years, that route, the roadbed, has been sold to the state, Commonwealth of Virginia and state of North Carolina, and there's talk about eventually building a high-speed route where the track had been. Another example comes in Ohio and Indiana, when the Broadway Limited and Capital Limited had to leave the Pennsylvania Railroad west of Crestline, Ohio, and end up operating over a couple of different routes. One, the Baltimore and Ohio line, which was very thin on traffic west of Akron, Ohio, for the Broadway, and then the Capital Limited finding the route that it has now, where it operates over the Pennsylvania up to Cleveland, and then the former New York Central into Chicago, and sharing the route with the Capital Limited. That's because Conrail wanted to move all of its trains, or almost all of its trains, off the former Pennsylvania Railroad through Fort Wayne from Crestline, and it did so, eventually selling a portion of that to Norfolk Southern, before technically acquiring it back in the Conrail split. But that's a whole nother fun quirk of rail history that we'll talk about in a future episode. But Amtrak was not set up to maintain lines like this, just not having the money to do so. The Northeast Corridor is one of the rare examples of it. So when it took over the Conn River line, a route that was operating on by exactly one train, operating twice per day, north and southbound Montrealer, it pretty much was evident that it could not keep this route, so it sold it to the Central Vermont. And so this is another thing that Guilford ended up suing over, because it was believed that the idea was, hey, if you're going to take it from us, you've got to operate it. But in reality, the Supreme Court and other courts ruled no, Amtrak could in fact basically flip the line, which is what they did. And today that is now part of the Central Vermont. And so the train didn't operate for a couple of years while they were rebuilding this route after they took it from Guilford / Boston and Maine. And then it began operating again in 1989 on this roundabout routing. So it would go up its former route as far as New Haven, Connecticut, and then proceed east on the shoreline, which is the route most of the Northeast Corridor trains take to Boston. Some of them go, or for a time went through Springfield, but in this case, it would go to New London, Connecticut on the shoreline, then attain Central Vermont trackage. That would take it all the way up, including now a portion of the Central Vermont owned, which was formerly the Boston, Maine's Connecticut River line, up to East Alburgh, Vermont, where it would attain Canadian National trackage for the last lap into Central Station. And this was not quite as successful, especially because you are skipping areas like Holyoke and Springfield, which were strong traffic generators. New London is certainly no slouch, and this is also before Casino Mania set in, and I believe you have Mohegan Sun there now, which certainly would be benefited by having a train coming very close to it. Closer to it than it already does, but this is before that happened. And so in 1995, as part of the cuts that were proposed by Mercer Management, and Mercer Management had been working with Amtrak to figure out how they could rationalize their network, given that their funding from Congress was going to decline, the Montrealer was one of the casualties, so it was gone. Well, the day after the Montrealer goes away, Amtrak starts operating a train over a similar route, but not the entire route, and that is the Vermonter that we have today. Now, at the time, the Vermonter, and this was funded by the state of Vermont, would then follow, strangely enough, the Montrealer's route back to Springfield, Massachusetts, before heading east on the Boston and Albany over to Palmer, Massachusetts, which is CP92. It's someplace you probably haven't heard of, very small community there, and it would switch directions to then get on the Central Vermont, where it would again be back on another former Montrealer route and take that up to Brattleboro, Vermont. Burlington, Vermont. Now, the issue became not long after the Vermonter started operating, when someone said, well, why can't we just go back to Montreal? Now, there hasn't been any definitive reason for that, but a lot of the stories, and I do say they're stories because I haven't been able to verify them, have said that Canadian National has asked too much for Amtrak to again use that route to get there. Now, Amtrak does operate over a portion of this route with the Adirondack, which is now their train which goes to Montreal, because it does utilize the several Canadian National lines north of Rouse's Point, New York. And just for a little background, in the past, service that operated there over the Delaware and Hudson to Rouse's Point and then Montreal operated over Delaware and Hudson subsidiary, the Naperville Junction Railway. Then that took it to Montreal's Windsor Station, which was shared with the Canadian Pacific. Central Station is the Canadian National Station, or former Canadian National Station, where the majority of Via Rail services operate out of today. And so while some of the same routes would be shared, a portion of it, Canadian National has been, at least according to stories, unwilling to allow Amtrak to go there without substantial capital improvements. But we have no way to verify that. Another thing to remember also, and this is something that is verified, is that the border crossing in the post-2004 time remains a problem for Amtrak everywhere it does it. This is not because of the Canadian authorities, but because U.S. authorities insist on doing what are called full inspections. And this had led to an end of the international service between Chicago and Toronto, and then a decline in usage of any of the Amtrak trains that go across the border into Canada. And the full inspections require people to get off the train and then be inspected in some form or another by U.S. Border Patrol. However, Canada has no problem with simply their officers getting on board the train and asking people where are they going, trying to determine if they're a problem or not, if there's anything precluding their entry into Canada. Another problem is the U.S. now requires passports to go between the U.S. and Canada, whereas in the past, and the last time I went to Montreal on the train, all you had to have was your driver's license to either go in or come back if you were a U.S. citizen. So those post 9/11 changes in border security for citizens ended up being a big negative for Amtrak passenger rail crossing between the 2 points. And also, as an aside, the Algoma Central Agawa Canyon tour train and services they were offering, because then Americans could no longer easily just come across from Michigan, spend the day on the train, do something fun, and then go back home. So there have been a lot of efforts to make adjustments to that. Senator Charles Schumer from New York has worked extensively about creating new ways of doing screening for international passengers, including someplace at Central Station in Montreal and also Penn Station in New York, where you could go and be screened and then presumably put in a portion of the train that is sealed, which is just to say the doors don't open and close while in the other country, so that you'll have been checked and there's no reason to recheck you at the border. And this is similar to what an airplane does. So, of course, airplanes are sealed because they're flying through the air, but you get the idea. But either way, those are some of the reasons why we have not seen a Montrealer return. But I did want to share a very interesting photo for those of you on CP5 Cam that I found of the Montrealer that I found to be quite interesting. And here you go. This is it with 3, not 1, not 2, but 3 AEM7s heading through Bridgeport, Connecticut. And why is that interesting to me? Well, first of all, it's interesting that the early AEM7s had Bud built bodies, and a lot of the cars in this train were also built by Bud, even if that was a difference of about 30 to 40 years in terms of when they were constructed. And the second thing that's interesting about it is I remember a trip heading up the same route on a different train when I had the opportunity to ride behind a 3 AEM7 consist, and let me tell you, it was definitely something that was far more interesting than I had seen on the rails in quite some time then. Now, we'll cover one more train here, and that is the James Whitcomb Riley, because the James Whitcomb Riley is probably a story that typifies early Amtrak and a lot of the struggles that the company faced as they were trying to get off the ground in their early years. Now, it began as 2 separate trains on 2 separate railroads. First, you had the New York Central's James Whitcomb Riley, named for a poet, and that operated over the Big Four, which is this Cleveland, Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis. That was a railroad the New York Central had purchased, and that dramatically expanded its network in Ohio and Indiana, leading up to Illinois. It operated between Kankakee, Illinois, and Chicago over the Illinois Central, because this is how the Big Four got into Chicago and terminated at Central Station in Grant Park. Why is that significant? Well, because the majority of New York Central trains terminated at LaSalle Street Station, which was shared with the Rock Island. Of course, this makes things interesting when you get to the Amtrak era. Now, as of the April 24th, 1966 timetable, and I've got that here, and I just want to show you. Here's that timetable itself. If you have not already done so, please go out, and when you have an opportunity, buy some old timetables. I know those probably aren't the most popular thing to buy at this point, and also I want to sell some of them to you, but these are invaluable when you're not only trying to understand how the railroad used to operate, but how the railroad could operate today. And you would be surprised how many times that a lot of modern efforts to start passenger rail, new starts, commuter, you name it, start with something like this, because you can bet there are plenty of people who are planners and otherwise that will tell you, hey, you know what, back in the 1960s, the New York Central did this. And then that can be the basis for saying, well, what are the markets we can look at today? Where are the traffic sources? Is there anything that we've missed? And this will certainly give you some of that information. Now, that Riley that they ran took you on a 6-hour journey between Chicago and Cincinnati via Indianapolis. And once you got there, you'd have a nearly 1-hour layover if you're headed eastbound, 55 minutes to be exact, to a Chesapeake and Ohio train. And that could be either the George Washington or the Fast Flying Virginian. And it's a little bit murky on that, because by the time you got into the 1960s, the C&O had done some discontinuances. The George Washington continued to operate in both directions between Washington and Cincinnati, with also a section to Newport News and the Norfolk area via ferry, as while it also had other trains, the Sportsman and the Fast Flying Virginian, but those operated in one direction only. So it created 2 round trips, but 3 different names. So that made it a little bit confusing. Now, as time goes on, though, the New York Central gives way to Penn Central. The Penn Central wasn't really enthusiastic about operating any passenger trains whatsoever. Neither was the New York Central in its final years. So the Penn Central had broken the connection between the C&O and the Riley. So if you were traveling between Chicago and Washington via this direction, via Cincinnati, you would get to Cincinnati a few hours after the eastbound train had left. And so this is one of the things that would help to bring patronage down and then make it easier to go to the Interstate Commerce Commission and boards of public utilities and say, hey, we want to get rid of this train. Nobody's riding it anymore. Well, of course they aren't, because it's kind of hard to get where you want to go if you might have to potentially stay an entire day in some place like Cincinnati, which is a fine community, but you're trying to get to the East Coast. Why not take a plane, or why not get in your car? So Amtrak takes over on May 1st, 1971, and they continue with the broken connection for some time, but eventually they put it together and they create one train, which they eventually named the James Whitcomb Riley. Now, what's so interesting about the Riley is that it really did hopscotch over just about every possible rail line in Ohio and Indiana to get between Cincinnati and Chicago. And here is a map on CP5 Cam to see what that really looked like. The blue is the James Whitcomb Riley itself. So you see Washington, Alexandria in the east. That's where the train would begin operating, utilizing the Southern Railway on Chesapeake and Ohio's access to it, which I don't want to call trackage rights because the agreement was a little bit more substantial than a simple operating rights agreement. Took it down to Charlottesville, Virginia. You also have the Newport News section there, which served Williamsburg and Richmond, and then combined with the Washington section at Charlottesville. And then you would go across the C&O, which is now the Buckingham Branch Main Line, where the excursions with the N&W 611 were operated during 2023, Stanton, Clifton Forge, then to White Sulphur Springs, where the Greenbrier is located, and at that time was still owned by the Chesapeake and Ohio, and then, of course, Charleston, West Virginia, Huntington, and then you see a location there, Tri-State. Tri-State was actually a new station that was constructed by Amtrak in Catlettsburg, Kentucky, because it was in an area that was near the borders of Ohio, West Virginia, and Kentucky, where one could get to all three pretty quickly. And then it would continue to Cincinnati. And as you note, there are no stops shown between Cincinnati and Chicago. That's because the route changed so many times. And this included, I believe, the C&EI. This included the Chesapeake and Ohio of Indiana. And all of this because track conditions on the Penn Central had gotten to be so bad that at one point a portion of this route was condemned by the FRA, and they would not allow, Federal Railroad Administration would not allow to operate passenger trains over that route. And there were a variety of changes that would take place, including court battles and whatnot. But this is also what gave the distinction of the James Whitcomb Riley, the distinction of being the only train that Amtrak's ever operated that is run regularly over the Erie-Lackawanna Railroad. And of course, you know, the Erie-Lackawanna Railroad is my favorite railroad. Well, it operated on the EL between Griffith, Indiana, and Hammond, Indiana, which is a relatively short distance. Cities are very close together, but that's because there was a shared track arrangement between the Erie-Lackawanna and the Chesapeake and Ohio of Indiana, where one carrier provided the eastbound track, the other carrier provided the westbound track. I believe the westbound track was the Erie-Lackawanna's, and they were operated as one railroad. So you didn't really notice any difference once you got there if you were operating a train or you were riding on a train, but that did give it that distinction. Unfortunately, it didn't last very long because when Conrail took over, this portion of the Erie-Lackawanna was something that did not continue its operation after the end of the EL. And a portion of it, of course, a big portion of it did continue to operate of the EL main line itself, but this meant that the train had to find another route, and that really just meant operating on the C&O track itself between Griffith and Hammond. So very small piece of track, but it is always a fun thing to think about when you're getting into the nuances of what passenger rail really does look like. Now, the Riley would continue to be a well patronized train, despite the fact that its territory was not terribly populated, at least a lot of it in western portions of Virginia and West Virginia, but it did substantial business in Ohio and Indiana. It did substantial business on the eastern end as well, so it remained a viable train. Later on, there was another train that was added that went with the Riley, and you see this here again in that map, and that is the Mountaineer. That was designed to restore service over the Norfolk and Western main line between Norfolk and, well, roughly Cincinnati, but really only went as far as the tri-state area, because then the tri-state station, because then it switched to the Chesapeake and Ohio route between Catlettsburg and Cincinnati. But a lot of the locales you're familiar with, if you're an N&W fan, Petersburg, Farmville, Lynchburg, Roanoke, of course, where the N&W is headquartered, and Bluefield, West Virginia, and not to mention the Christiansburg grade and the tunnel, where you've seen the 611 and 1218. Those steam locomotives do a lot of their famous excursion running. That was a route that was reinstituted. Amtrak President Paul Reistrup, I remember reading that he said this route was going to lose a lot of money, and it did lose a lot of money, and that is what led to its relatively quick end and replacement with the infamous Hilltopper, which we should probably talk about in another episode, but most people want to forget the Hilltopper because it was a small train that didn't carry very many people and was operated primarily, just like the Mountaineer, because of Congressman Harley Staggers, who ended up being the man whose name was on the railroad deregulation bill, but in these early Amtrak days was known for being the person who pushed very hard to get passenger trains to operate through his district and his state that were not necessarily well patronized and ended up being, in some cases, albatrosses around the company's neck. So, I hope you've enjoyed this discussion. It's been very interesting for me because as I've read through a lot of the literature, a lot of which I'd heard before, but wanted to get new eyes on it, it's so interesting, a lot of the struggles that Amtrak had to go through in order to operate a very small number of trains early in its existence. And in order to keep these trains running, whether we're talking about the old equipment or the station buildings that were falling down, it's very, very interesting to see how quickly passenger service in the United States had declined after the end of the 1950s. And this was certainly something that it's understandable now why passengers deserted the trains. And you can't really place the blame, as we talked about in our last episode, who really shot the passenger train. You can't point necessarily at the railroads themselves. You can't point necessarily at the customers who decided they weren't going to be customers anymore. You can't necessarily point the finger at government. You can't necessarily point the fingers at car builders or other equipment manufacturers. You got to really point the finger at everyone, because to a certain extent it was actions by everyone in some form which led to it. Passengers saying, hey, we've got a new way to get around. You can take your car, drive your car from point A to point B, and if you want to stop to see that really neat attraction, you can do it. Well, that's a natural thing that people are going to want to do, so that meant fewer people were going to ride the train. You had local governments who taxed the heck out of railroads and then used the money, as a good example being Cleveland, Ohio specifically, in Cleveland Union Terminal, one of the places that Amtrak abandoned fairly early on. Its first train to operate through there was called the Lake Shore, not the Lake Shore Limited, but the Lake Shore, which operated for a little more than a year between New York and Chicago, and was actually an inner-city train that was funded under the 403B program that allows states to fund the loss or help to cover the losses of a particular train if they wanted something outside of what Amtrak wanted to run on its own. And one of the first things they did was got out of Cleveland Union Terminal because it was so expensive, number one. But also, let's remember, the city of Cleveland put a tax on the tickets sold at Cleveland Union Terminal for the express purpose of funding Hopkins Airport. So you can't think about any worse thing than people having to be convinced to travel on your mode of transportation, and then they're going to get hit with a tax. that's going to go to directly fund your competitor. And that's to say nothing of the property taxes and other costs that are associated with compliance of the various rules that were heaped on railroads that weren't found on other modes of transportation. And then, of course, you have to look at the railroads themselves. You look at some of the photos of the late private era passenger trains and the early Amtrak era passenger trains. The equipment looked dilapidated, and it often was. The trains were short. The employees were said to be surly, and quite frankly, although I don't really like bad customer service, it's kind of understandable that when you're in a situation where nobody wants to provide the service that you're providing and people aren't riding it, and probably the few people who are riding it are upset about something or other that's out of your control, such as, for example, expecting to be able to go between Chicago and, let's say, the Greenbrier, and realizing you're going to have to wait 24 hours in Cincinnati in order to continue your trip because management decided to break the connection. Well, a lot of times that's going to get taken out on the employees, and then suddenly the employees are going to be less enthusiastic about serving the public. So, a lot goes out to the people who started and did the hard work of operating Amtrak. Most of the people, we won't know their names. They were engineers, conductors for the private railroads who staffed those trains. They were some of those early onboard service personnel people. They were some of the people who worked in the office and did what they could to try to move money around and assets and so forth in order to make things go. So, as I said, while we will robustly criticize Amtrak for a lot of the dumb things they have done, and they've done some, we are thankful to them for doing what it takes to keep a light of passenger rail alive until we get to the point where we can again have robust private sector engagement in this. And I do certainly hope and pray that we get that as well. So we will be back tomorrow to talk about this book again, which is 50 Years of Amtrak Trains by David Warner and Bruce Goldberg. We'll be doing our review, and that will close out our passenger train week. Thank you for choosing All Things Trains, and we will see you down the main line.